He was a man the world refused to see, shoved into alleys, spat on by strangers, and treated as if his existence was a stain on the city's image. Every glance he received was either filled with pity or disgust, as if his humanity had been stripped away along with his home. But beneath the dirt and despair lay a truth so shocking, so unimaginable, that if anyone knew who he truly was, the same people who ignored him would fall to their knees in disbelief. The city had always been a living, breathing entity, its pulse echoing through the streets, its heartbeat measured by the relentless rhythm of car horns, footsteps, and whispered conversations in shadowed alleys. The concrete jungle, however, had its dark corners, places where light rarely reached, and where the air hung heavy with secrets. Tonight, those secrets were palpable. The sky was a shade of bruised purple, clouds swirling ominously as though caught in an unseen storm. The wind, sharp and biting, cut through the air, carrying with it the faint scent of rain mixed with something far less natural, a hint of something burning, a faraway smoke that clung to the breath of the city. Beneath a flickering street lamp, a man stood motionless, as if he were a part of the shadows themselves. His eyes, hard as steel, scanned the empty street, watching every car that passed by, every footstep that echoed in the distance. He didn't belong here, not in this part of town, not in this life. Yet here he was, his face drawn with the weight of his years, the roughness of a life lived on the margins etched into his features. Nathaniel, a name lost to most, but to him, it was the only thing left that tied him to a life he no longer remembered. A black man in his mid-30s, his clothes were tattered, his shoes worn down to mere shells of their former selves. The hollow look in his eyes revealed more than words ever could. This was a man who had been stripped of everything but his survival instinct. As the faint hum of an approaching car grew louder, his body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring. The car stopped just a few feet away from him, its engine cutting out with a soft sputter. The door swung open, and from within stepped Isabel, a young white girl, no more than 16, with eyes that held storm. She had the kind of beauty that was almost otherworldly, but it was the look in her eyes that caught Nathaniel off guard. There was something in her gaze, something familiar, that made his heart skip. She stepped toward him, the sound of her footsteps muffled against the wet pavement. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch when their eyes met. She knew what this place could do to someone like him, someone who didn't belong. But she wasn't here for him. She was here for someone else. "What are you doing here?" Nathaniel's voice was low, gravelly, but it held an edge of curiosity. Isabel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced around the empty street, her face tight with anxiety. Her breath came in quick bursts, like she was struggling to keep herself together. And that was when Nathaniel noticed it. The tear in her jacket, the scuff marks on her shoes, the desperation in her posture. She wasn't just lost. She was running from something. "I need help," Isabel finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I don't know who else to turn to." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened. It wasn't uncommon for people to come to him when they had nowhere else to go. But this girl, she was different. He could see it in the way she stood there, unafraid of a man like him, the danger of this place forgotten in her need for something. "Someone. Help," he repeated, almost scoffing. "Help ain't something you find in a place like this, girl. It's a game of survival here. Ain't no help." But Isabel was insistent. She took a step closer, her voice more desperate now. "I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm being followed. I don't know who they are, but they want something from me. Please, you're the only one who can help me." Nathaniel's expression darkened, his gaze flicking behind her, scanning the street. He knew trouble when he saw it, and trouble had a habit of following people like her. The rich, the innocent, the ones who didn't belong here in the city's underbelly. "Who's following you?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Isabel hesitated, biting her lip before she spoke. "My father. He's in danger because of me. I don't know how to fix this. I just need a way out." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes, trying to piece together the puzzle. A girl running from something, someone chasing her, her father involved. It didn't add up, but the urgency in her eyes, it was real. The kind of fear that wasn't just about losing something, but about losing everything. Before he could say anything more, a noise echoed in the distance. A car engine revving, tires screeching. The sound sent a chill down Nathaniel's spine. They were getting closer. "Who are they?" Nathaniel asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know," Isabel said, her voice trembling. "But they've been following me for days. They won't stop until they get what they want." In that moment, Nathaniel saw it all. The fear, the helplessness, the desperation. He saw a piece of himself in her, a life he once had, a life that had been taken from him in one cruel swipe. And for the first time in years, something stirred inside him. A sense of duty, perhaps. A need to protect someone who wasn't just another face in the crowd. Without another word, Nathaniel grabbed her arm and pulled her into the shadows, just as the car that had been following her screeched to a halt at the corner. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the alleyway briefly before fading into the darkness. As the car sat motionless at the street corner, Nathaniel held Isabel against the cold, damp brick of a nearby building. He could feel her pulse racing, her body trembling against his as she tried to make herself as small as possible. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently, his eyes darting to the vehicle. He had no idea who these people were, but one thing was certain. They wouldn't stop until they had her. And Nathaniel wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. The night was thick with tension, the shadows creeping closer with every breath. Nathaniel remained still, his body pressed against the damp brick of the alley, his eyes flicking back to the car parked across the street. The headlights were off now, but the engine hummed faintly, like the quiet growl of an approaching predator. Isabel stood beside him, her breath shallow, her body trembling, her gaze fixed on the darkened streets beyond. In this moment, everything seemed suspended in time, the kind of suspended animation that only exists in the spaces between life and death. The world outside might have continued on without them, but in the alley, it was just the two of them, a homeless man with nothing to lose and a frightened girl with everything to protect. Nathaniel had learned early on that in the city, survival wasn't a matter of how much you had, but how little you needed. The world had taken almost everything from him, his family, his job, his home, until all that remained were his instincts and his name, a name that had long since faded from the minds of the people he once knew. Now, he lived in the shadows, a ghost in his own life. His face was worn, weathered by years of struggle. His eyes, once warm and hopeful, had hardened into steel, a man forged by loss, but not broken. He had learned to navigate the underbelly of the city like a predator in his own right, moving between forgotten alleyways, cracked sidewalks, and discarded lives. The world didn't offer pity to men like him, and he didn't want it. What mattered was what he could control, and he had learned to control everything, his hunger, his fears, and his surroundings. But there was something in Isabel's eyes that made him hesitate. She wasn't like the others. She didn't belong in his world, but she had been dragged into it by forces far beyond her control. That much was clear. As they stood in the darkened alley, Nathaniel felt a shift, a stir in him, something he hadn't felt in years. A pull to protect. His motivations, once limited to surviving the harshest of days, began to take on a new meaning. He wasn't just a man surviving in the shadows anymore. For the first time in a long while, he had a reason to step into the light. Isabel was a study in contradictions. She was the daughter of a man with power and influence, a life that most would envy, yet she had never felt less in control. Raised in a world where wealth and status shielded her from the harsh realities others faced, she had never once questioned the privilege that surrounded her. Her life was a carefully curated series of moments, all meticulously arranged, until everything began to fall apart. Her father was a businessman, a man who had made his fortune in the cutthroat world of finance. His ambition had driven him to the top, but had also made him distant, cold. Isabel had never quite understood the gap between them, the way he remained an unreachable figure in her life. The distance between them had only grown in recent months, as his business dealings began to take a darker turn. Isabel had always been curious, but her curiosity had often been met with caution, especially when it came to her father's affairs. He was protective, always trying to shield her from things she didn't need to know. But that didn't stop her from uncovering things she wasn't supposed to see: documents hidden in his office, phone calls in the dead of night, cryptic messages she couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until she stumbled upon one of her father's secrets, one he'd gone to great lengths to keep hidden, that she found herself entangled in a world far darker than she could have imagined. Her father's business was tied to people with influence, dangerous people who didn't take kindly to being crossed. And Isabel had unwittingly become part of something she couldn't escape. But it wasn't just her father's enemies she had to worry about. There were forces within her own family, within her own bloodline, that had begun to stir, secrets long buried, connections to people and events she couldn't comprehend. Her world had tilted, leaving her grasping for something solid, something real. She didn't know who to trust anymore. And that's when she turned to Nathaniel. For Nathaniel, the introduction of Isabel into his life represented a new kind of threat, a challenge to his carefully constructed world. He didn't want to get involved, didn't want to play the hero. He had learned long ago that it was safer to remain invisible, to keep his head down and his heart locked away. But Isabel's presence, her desperate plea for help, ignited something inside him, a desire to act, to fight, even though he knew nothing of the battle she was fighting. Isabel's goal was simple: survival, but was more than just escaping the physical threat that hung over her. She had to uncover the truth, to understand what her father had been hiding, and why it was all crumbling around her. She was out of her depth, but there was a fire in her, a determination to fix the wreckage that had become her life. But the external conflict was not just about escaping danger. It was about a deeper, more insidious fight, a battle between two worlds, two identities that had collided in the most unexpected way. Nathaniel, a man who had nothing left, and Isabel, a girl who had everything but the truth. They were linked by a common enemy, a shadowy force that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Isabel's father was at the center of it, but the reach of the enemy was vast, extending into places Nathaniel didn't even know existed. The stakes were high, and neither of them fully understood the game they were playing. Nathaniel had learned to trust no one, to rely on his own instincts. But Isabel was different. She needed him, whether he wanted to be needed or not. As they moved through the alleyways, Nathaniel found himself struggling with an internal conflict he hadn't anticipated. Helping Isabel meant stepping back into a world he had long since abandoned. It meant caring, something he had trained himself not to do. But as he looked at her, young, frightened, yet undeniably strong, he realized he could never turn away. He had seen enough of a world to know what happened to people who didn't have anyone to fight for them. Every decision he made would carry weight, and in that moment, it was clear that his actions, however small, could tip the balance of everything. For Isabel, the danger wasn't just physical, it was emotional. She had spent so long trying to please her father, trying to be the perfect daughter, but now that she was faced with the terrifying reality of her father's secrets, she found herself questioning everything she had ever known. She didn't know who she could trust. Nathaniel, this homeless man who had come out of nowhere, was suddenly her only ally, and she had to decide if she was willing to trust him with everything: her past, her future, and even her own safety. In the silence of the alley, with the faint hum of the city in the distance, Isabel realized that her world would never be the same. She was no longer the girl she once was, sheltered and naive. She was a part of something much larger and far more dangerous. As they moved deeper into the shadows, both Nathaniel and Isabel were on the cusp of something that would change their lives forever. The danger was closing in, but neither of them could fully comprehend how their fates were intertwined. They were stepping into a storm, each with their own personal battles to fight, but in the end, they would have to face it together or be torn apart. The night had fallen silent, save for the faint rustling of the wind against the damp pavement. Isabel and Nathaniel had moved deeper into the alleyways, each step taking them further from the reach of the black sedan that had been idling nearby. The shadows around them seemed to grow thicker as the minutes ticked by, swallowing the world outside. Nathaniel led the way, his movements swift and calculated, while Isabel followed closely, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't yet articulate. Despite the tension that crackled in the air, there was a strange sense of calm between them, an unspoken understanding that the world had shifted, and neither of them knew exactly where it was taking them. Nathaniel's instincts had always served him well. They were his compass, guiding him through darkened streets, alleyways, and broken places. He knew how to survive. But tonight, something was different. It wasn't just the girl. There was something else in the air, something he couldn't shake, like the distant rumble of a storm, far off but inevitable. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Isabel's voice cut through the silence, a soft tremor in her words. Nathaniel didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning their surroundings. They were nearing the end of the alley, where it would open up into the city's underbelly, an area of dilapidated buildings, abandoned storefronts, and broken streetlights. The perfect place to hide, for a while, at least. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. "But I know one thing. They won't stop until they get what they want from you. And that means you're in more danger than you realize." Isabel glanced at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "What do you mean? What do they want from me?" Nathaniel paused, his gaze flicking to the flickering street lamp at the end of the alley. "I don't know, but I'm willing to bet it's something your father didn't want you to find." She nodded, her face pale in the dim light. She knew that much, at least. But the questions swirling in her head only seemed to multiply. Who were these people after her? What kind of trouble had her father gotten him into? Before Nathaniel could offer any further insight, a sudden noise, a soft scraping sound, reached their ears. Nathaniel's hand shot out, grabbing Isabel's arm and pulling her into the shadows, just as a figure appeared at the edge of the alley. It was a man, tall and imposing, his features obscured by the darkness. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the area with a predator's focus. Behind him, the faint glow of headlights illuminated the street. Nathaniel tensed, his body coiling like a spring. He knew that look. That was the look of someone who didn't just belong to the shadows. They controlled them. The man's steps slowed as he approached, his gaze lingering in the direction of the alley. Isabel's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, but Nathaniel's grip tightened on her arm, silencing her. "Stay quiet," Nathaniel whispered, his voice like a razor. "We need to wait." Isabel nodded, her mind racing. Who was this man, and what did he want with them? The figure lingered for a moment, then turned, disappearing into the dark. They were safe, for now. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his grip loosening around Isabel's arm. "Let's move," he muttered. "We've got to keep going." Isabel didn't argue. There was something in the air now, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, followed even. They moved quickly, staying close to the walls of the buildings as they navigated the narrow streets. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the night itself was pressing down on them. Nathaniel was still ahead, his senses alert, his eyes constantly darting around them. Isabel kept pace, but her mind was elsewhere, racing with thoughts of her father and the danger she was in. The street ahead was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, where the world feels like it's holding its breath. As they rounded a corner, the world seemed to explode. A car screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking their path. The headlights were blinding, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Nathaniel reacted instantly, pulling Isabel behind a nearby dumpster, but the car doors opened before they could take cover completely. Two figures emerged, both men, both armed. "Come on out, sweetheart," a voice called from the shadows. It was rough, gravelly, and filled with malice. "You're not getting away this time." Isabel's heart raced. The world was closing in on her, and there was nowhere to run. Nathaniel's hand shot to his side, his fingers brushing the knife he kept tucked in his waistband. His eyes flicked between the two men, calculating, weighing the odds. "You don't need to do this," Nathaniel called out, his voice steady despite the tension in his chest. "There's no reason to hurt her." The men laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent a shiver down Isabel's spine. "She's the reason," one of them said. "She knows too much, and now she's got to pay the price." Nathaniel's grip tightened around the knife's handle, but he didn't draw it. He wasn't stupid. He knew better than to provoke them. They were professionals. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just some street thugs. Isabel's thoughts were a blur, but one thing cut through the noise. Her father. This was about him. Somehow, he had drawn these men into their lives, into hers. She wasn't just a random target. This was personal. But as Nathaniel took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the two men, a sudden sense of dread filled the air. A car engine revved, louder than before, and Nathaniel's expression shifted, eyes widening with the realization that they weren't just dealing with a couple of hired guns. A third car appeared, speeding into the alley from the other direction. The men with guns exchanged nervous glances. They weren't prepared for this. Nathaniel pushed Isabel further behind the dumpster, his body shielding her from sight. The tension in the air thickened like a storm cloud, and in that moment, everything seemed to pause. And then, the shot rang out. The world erupted into chaos. The gunshot was followed by a second, a third, each one sharper than the last. Nathaniel's mind raced as he pulled Isabel to the ground, shielding her with his body. The sound of screaming filled the air, but it wasn't Isabel. It was the men who had been standing just moments ago, who had now collapsed to the pavement in a crumpled heap. From the car that had appeared at the other end of the alley, a figure stepped out, tall, imposing, wearing a black suit. His face was cold, expressionless. He held a gun, but it wasn't pointed at them. Not yet. Nathaniel's eyes widened with recognition. This man wasn't just some thug. This man was something else entirely. Someone much higher up the food chain. "Get up," the man ordered, his voice smooth, almost calm in contrast to the chaos around him. "You've got something I need, and I don't take kindly to people who make me work for what's mine." Nathaniel's pulse raced. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The stakes were no longer just about survival. This was about power, about an enemy who had his sights set on Isabel. And somehow, Nathaniel was right in the middle of it. As the scene unfolded around them, the inciting event, the attack on Isabel, propelled them both into a larger, darker conflict. Nathaniel and Isabel had no choice now but to face the truth. The forces arrayed against them were far more powerful than they could have ever imagined. And this was only the beginning. The chill in the air was sharp and biting as Nathaniel and Isabel navigated the narrow streets of the city. The chaos from the alley had died down, but its aftershocks still vibrated through the cold, concrete landscape. They had managed to escape. Barely, but there was no illusion of safety now. The figure in the black suit, the one who had walked into the alley like a shadow with the cold eyes of a predator, haunted their every step. He was a specter now, lurking in the background, and Nathaniel could feel his presence pressing in on them from every direction. Isabel walked beside him, her face pale and tight with fear. Her once strong and defiant posture had softened under the weight of what had happened. She hadn't spoken much since the gunshots had shattered the night. Her eyes darted from every shadow, every corner, every flicker of movement. She wasn't just scared. She was terrified. Terrified of the unknown, of the danger that had suddenly erupted into her life without warning. What happens now? Isabel's voice was a whisper, fragile and unsure. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He knew she was looking to him for guidance, for answers that he didn't have. But he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. He kept walking, his pace quickening as they neared an abandoned building at the edge of the city, its broken windows dark and empty. The structure loomed ahead like a giant skeleton, a relic of a time long past. "We find shelter," Nathaniel finally replied, his voice calm but carrying an edge of determination. We can't afford to stay in the open any longer." Isabel nodded, still too shaken to speak. She had to trust him, but she didn't know if she could. Her father had always kept her in the dark about his work, his secrets. The last few days had shattered everything she thought she knew. Now, her life was a tangled mess of threats, lies, and unanswered questions. And at the center of it all stood Nathaniel, a man she had only just met, but who had already risked everything for her. She didn't understand it, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't do this alone. Inside the abandoned building, Nathaniel led Isabel to a secluded corner, away from the main entrance. The walls were grimy, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. It was a temporary haven at best, but it would have to do. Nathaniel paced back and forth, his mind working through their next steps, his thoughts fragmented. He knew the man in the black suit would be after them. That much was obvious. But who was he? What was his connection to Isabel's father? And why had the man in the alley been so intent on capturing her? As these questions circled in his mind, there was an unsettling feeling gnawing at him. It was the same feeling he had gotten just before a storm hit. Something big was coming, and they weren't ready for it. Isabel shifted uncomfortably, glancing nervously at the shadows in the corners of the room. "Do you think they're still looking for us?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt down and began pulling something from his backpack, a map, a small notebook, and a set of photographs. He spread them out on the floor in front of Isabel, each one more puzzling than the last. "What's all this?" Isabel asked, a sense of dread creeping into her voice. Nathaniel's eyes flicked over the images. "These are pieces of the puzzle I've been trying to solve for years. Your father's involvement with these people goes deeper than you think. This isn't just some random crime syndicate. They have connections everywhere." Isabel leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she examined the photos. There were images of meetings in dimly lit rooms, faces obscured by shadows, and men in suits, standing side by side with her father. But none of this made sense. Why would her father be involved with people like this? Who are they? Isabel whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do they want with me?" Nathaniel paused, staring at the photos for a long moment. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." It was then that a sound broke through the silence. A distant screech of tires, a car engine revving in the distance. Nathaniel's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for Isabel to stay quiet and pressed his ear to the wall, straining to hear. Footsteps. Not just one pair, but several. They were being tracked. Before they could react, the door to the building creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. The newcomer was tall, with a weathered face that spoke of hard times and even harder choices. His clothes were simple, worn jeans and a jacket that had seen better days, but there was an air of authority in his stance. He had the quiet confidence of someone who had survived the worst and come out the other side. "Relax," the man said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Nathaniel's hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, but he held it in check. The man didn't look like a threat, but appearances could be deceiving. "Who thou are you?" Nathaniel demanded, his voice sharp. The man's lips twitched into a half-smile. "Name's Carter. I've been tracking you for a while now." Nathaniel stiffened. "Tracking us? Why?" Carter stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the map on the floor. "Let's just say I'm here to help. You're not the only one with a stake in this." Isabel shot Nathaniel a glance, confusion written all over her face. "Help? What are you talking about?" Carter exhaled slowly. "You're caught in something much bigger than you realize. Your father's actions have put a target on your back. And those men who came after you, they're just the beginning. The people behind them, they don't stop. They don't forgive. And they don't forget." Nathaniel took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "So, what's your angle, Carter? You're not doing this out of the goodness of your heart." Carter smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew how the world worked, who had seen it all and survived. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to take these guys down. You might be able to help me with that." Isabel looked between the two men, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. She had no idea who Carter was or what his involvement in this was, but something about his demeanor told her that he wasn't someone to be trusted easily. "You've been following us," she said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her chest. "How do we know we can trust you?" Carter chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "You don't. But right now, you don't have much of a choice, do you?" Nathaniel looked at Isabel, his expression hard to read. He was calculating the situation, weighing the options. They couldn't afford to trust anyone easily, but this man seemed to know things that could be crucial to understanding what was happening. "Fine," Nathaniel said finally. "We'll work together for now. But if you cross us, you won't live long enough to regret it." Carter held up his hands in mock surrender. "I wouldn't dream of it, but you'll need all the help you can get. Trust me on that." With Carter's arrival, the stakes were raised higher than ever before. What had once been a simple matter of survival had turned into a complex game with too many players and not enough answers. Carter's involvement signaled that their enemies were not just local criminals. They were part of a much larger web, one that reached far beyond anything Nathaniel or Isabel had imagined. As the night stretched on, the three of them began to formulate a plan, but there was one unspoken truth that lingered in the air. They were not alone in this fight, and the road ahead would be treacherous, filled with even greater dangers. For Isabel, the danger had never felt more real. Her life, once so carefully constructed and predictable, was now a volatile force she could not control. Nathaniel was her only anchor, but even he was carrying secrets of his own, secrets that might one day put them at odds. But as they huddled in the shadows of the abandoned building, one thing was clear. They were all in this together now, bound by a shared goal, to survive. And the path to survival would be anything but easy. The early morning fog still clung to the streets as Nathaniel and Isabel walked side by side, the weight of the city pressing in from all sides. The cold air cut through their clothes, a stark reminder that nothing in this world would come easy. After what had happened last night, neither of them had managed much sleep, and the shadows under their eyes told the story of fear and sleepless nights. Still, the air felt thick, charged, as though something was waiting to erupt. They had spent hours mapping out their next move, following the leads Carter had given them. As much as Nathaniel hated to admit it, Carter's information had been invaluable, though his motives remained unclear. The man was a riddle wrapped in enigma, and Nathaniel had a sinking feeling that the more they got entangled with him, the further they would sink into a web of deceit and violence. But for now, he had to play along. Isabel was counting on him. "Where are we going?" Isabel's voice broke through the silence. Nathaniel glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We're meeting someone who knows more about the people we're up against." The city around them felt alive, yet eerily quiet. The streets were empty, as though the world was holding its breath. But there was a constant hum in the background. The distant sound of engines, the occasional cry of a hawker on the corner, the rustle of papers in the wind. It was a city that never fully slept. In the corners, in the cracks of the urban sprawl, secrets grew, and Nathaniel was about to uncover some of the most dangerous ones. They walked deeper into the heart of Industrial District. The buildings here were taller, their skeletal frames piercing the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers trying to reach for something just out of grasp. The air tasted like metal, sharp and bitter, the scent of oil and rust filling their lungs. There was a heavy stillness in the atmosphere, as though the city was about to crack open and reveal its dark secrets. Finally, they arrived at their destination, a small, unmarked building on the edge of a narrow alley. The door was ajar, and the faint sound of voices floated through the crack. Nathaniel stepped forward, his hand resting on the cold metal handle, and paused. His mind was spinning, trying to anticipate what would happen next. "Are you sure about this?" Isabel asked, her voice thick with unease. "I mean, after everything that's happened, we don't know these people." Nathaniel hesitated, then turned to face her. "We don't have a choice. This is our best shot." Isabel nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart race. He saw a flicker of trust there, but also a trace of fear. She didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went yet. None of them did. They pushed the door open, entering a dimly lit room. The air inside smelled stale, damp, and heavy. A long wooden table sat in the center, flanked by a few worn chairs. At the far end of the room, a man sat behind a desk, his fingers steepled, watching them approach. His face was pale, lined with age and experience, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Sit," he said, his voice a low growl. Nathaniel hesitated, but took a seat across from the man, Isabel following his lead. The silence stretched for several moments, each second pulling the tension tighter. The man didn't speak again until he'd sized them up thoroughly. "I assume you know why you're here." Nathaniel's mind raced, but he kept his expression steady. "You have information on the people we're looking for." The man leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving them. "Information is a funny thing," he said, his voice dripping with cynicism. "Some things are better left buried, but I suppose you wouldn't be here if you didn't want to dig it all up." Isabel shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the man's tone. She clenched her hands, her nails digging into her palms. Nathaniel knew she was desperate for answers, but this man was giving nothing away. Yet, "I'm listening," Nathaniel said. The man studied him for a moment longer before leaning forward, his eyes glinting with a secret knowledge that made the hairs on the back of Nathaniel's neck stand on end. "Your father," he began slowly, letting the words hang in the air like a weight. "Your father wasn't just involved with these people. He was one of them." The room seemed to shrink as the words settled between them. Isabel's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief. She looked at Nathaniel, as if trying to read his reaction. Nathaniel's stomach twisted into a knot, but he kept his voice steady. "That's impossible," Isabel said, her voice wavering. "My father was a good man. He wouldn't be involved with people like this." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "The truth is rarely simple. Your father had a price, just like everyone else. And that price wasn't paid in cash." Nathaniel clenched his fists under the table. He knew this was coming, but hearing it felt like a punch to the gut. The secrets that Isabel's father had kept were more dangerous than he had ever imagined. This was no longer just about survival. It was about uncovering a legacy of lies and betrayal that reached further than he could have ever anticipated. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel pressed, his voice low and dangerous. The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of grim seriousness. "The organization your father worked with, it's older than you think. It's been around for decades, operating in the shadows, pulling strings. Your father made deals with them, deals that cost more than money. And when he got in too deep, he was bound to them. Not by choice, not by contract, but by blood." The words hung in the air, a terrible truth slowly seeping into the room. Isabel's face drained of color, and Nathaniel felt a chill settle over him. "Blood." Isabel's voice was barely a whisper. "What does that mean?" The man's eyes flicked to Nathaniel, then back to Isabel. "Your father made an oath, and in this world, oaths are more powerful than anything. He swore loyalty to them, and when you were born," he paused, letting the implications sink in, "you were marked." Nathaniel's mind was spinning. Marked? What the hell was this man talking about? But as he looked at Isabel, he saw the way her shoulders slumped, the way her eyes clouded with confusion and fear. This wasn't the same girl he had met days ago. This was someone whose entire world had just shattered. "You don't know what you're dealing with," the man said, his voice low and final. And that's the biggest problem. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them, suffocating the air in the small room. Isabel sat frozen, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. Nathaniel, on the other hand, was already trying to figure out the next move. But the sheer magnitude of the truth, The discovery of her father's ties to a secret and dangerous organization left him feeling as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. They had been following the trail without knowing the full picture, but now they were in the middle of something far darker than they had ever imagined. Isabel finally found her voice, her words trembling but fierce. "My father didn't tell me any of this. How could he keep something like this from me?" The man behind the desk leaned forward, his expression cold. "You think you're the first person to be kept in the dark? People don't tell their children everything, especially when the truth is too dangerous to hear. You were never meant to know any of this. But now that you do," his eyes narrowed, "you have a choice to make." Nathaniel's gaze turned icy. "What kind of choice?" The man's lips curled. "You can walk away. You can pretend you never heard a word I said, or you can help me finish what your father started." The air in the room felt suffocating as Nathaniel and Isabel exchanged a glance, the gravity of the situation settling heavily upon them. Their options were limited, their futures uncertain. But as the man's gaze lingered on them, something in the air shifted. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a battle for control over the very truth of their lives. The night felt unusually heavy, as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nathaniel stood at the edge of the rooftop, his hands braced against the cold stone, staring down at the flashing lights below. The city was alive with motion, but it seemed so far removed from the turmoil raging inside him. The revelation about Isabel's father had broken the fragile peace they'd held onto, and with each passing moment, the weight of their predicament grew heavier. Behind him, Isabel stood at the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the flickering light from the hallway. She hadn't said much since the meeting with the man in the alley, but Nathaniel could feel the tension between them, thick and suffocating. She had been silent, distant, her eyes clouded with confusion and doubt. The lines between right and wrong had blurred for both of them. "We need to talk." Isabel's voice cut through the silence, the words heavy with unspoken questions. Nathaniel turned, his eyes locking onto hers. He didn't need to ask. He knew what was going through her mind. The man had told them things they weren't ready to hear. The words about her father's oath, the blood ties, the hidden world he'd been part of. It had torn open a wound that neither of them knew how to heal. "Talk," Nathaniel repeated, his voice colder than he intended. "What's there to talk about? The truth is out. Your father was involved with them, and now they're after us." Isabel flinched at the bitterness in his tone. She lowered her gaze, her fingers tracing the edge of the doorframe. "I didn't ask for any of this," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "I didn't ask for a father who lived in shadows, or for my life to be turned upside down like this. I just want answers." Nathaniel's heart softened at her words, but the storm inside him didn't let up. The truth was painful, but it had opened doors to something much worse. They couldn't afford to ignore the danger that was closing in on them. "We'll get answers," Nathaniel said, his voice firm, but beneath it lay the weight of his own uncertainty. "But we need to move fast. They'll be coming for us." Just then, a faint noise from the street below broke their conversation. The unmistakable sound of tires screeching, followed by the unmistakable thud of a car slamming into a barricade. Nathaniel's pulse quickened. He moved instinctively, rushing to the window as the sound of sirens filled the air. What the hell is going on? Isabel's voice trembled as she stepped beside him, peering out at the chaos unfolding below. Down in the street, two black SUVs were parked haphazardly near a corner. A group of men, roughly dressed, their faces hidden by masks, were dragging someone out of one of the vehicles. The figure was limp, barely conscious, but Nathaniel recognized the form immediately. "Carter," he muttered, his blood running cold. Before Isabel could react, Nathaniel was already on the move, heading for the door. "We have to go. Now." They didn't have time to think. Nathaniel grabbed his jacket and yanked it on, then headed for the staircase. Isabel followed close behind, her breathing erratic, as though she knew, deep down, that things were spiraling out of control. As they made their way down the darkened staircase, Nathaniel's thoughts raced. Carter had been a loose end, someone who had given them information about the people they were up against. But why was he involved? Why had they taken him? The two of them burst through the alley behind their building, ducking into the shadows. Nathaniel kept his eyes on the street, trying to stay one step ahead. But the closer they got to the chaos, the more his instinct screamed that they were being watched. Why would they take Carter? Isabel asked, her voice full of panic. Nathaniel didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the scene ahead. He knew too much. But as they approached the corner, things took a dangerous turn. Out of nowhere, a black motorcycle revved, cutting through the alley with ruthless precision. Before Nathaniel could react, a man on the bike skidded to a stop in front of them, blocking their path. He wore a helmet, his face hidden, but Nathaniel recognized the build, the sleek, predatory way he moved. "It's them," Nathaniel muttered under his breath. The same group that had been following them, the same people who had marked Isabel's father, the ones they had no choice but to face. The man on the motorcycle revved the engine again, and before they could make a move, the air was pierced by a shrill, unnatural sound, a high-pitched frequency that seemed to vibrate in Nathaniel's chest, throwing his balance off. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt as though the world was spinning in fast forward. "Go!" Isabel screamed, pulling at his arm. But it was too late. A dark van screeched around the corner, its headlights blinding them, and in the chaos, a second man leapt from the van, tackling Nathaniel to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and before he could fully recover, the man had a knife pressed against his throat. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," the man hissed, his voice muffled through his mask. Isabel fought back with every ounce of strength she had, kicking and punching, but there were too many of them. The world had become a blur of flashing lights, the screeching of tires, and the overwhelming sound of her heart pounding in her ears. Nathaniel's mind raced, his body trapped beneath the weight of the attacker. He was already considering his next move when, suddenly, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" A figure stepped out from the shadows, a tall silhouette silhouetted against the city lights. The man was dressed in black, his posture authoritative, yet there was something about him, something familiar. The attacker holding Nathaniel down froze, momentarily distracted. Nathaniel's eyes widened. It was Carter. But it wasn't the Carter he had known. This version of him was colder, more ruthless. Something had changed. The man Nathaniel had trusted was no longer the ally he had thought he was. "I told you," Carter said, his voice calm and chilling. "This was always bigger than you. You had no idea who you were really dealing with." Nathaniel's stomach dropped, a feeling of betrayal sinking deep into his bones. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. "What are you talking about?" Isabel shouted, her voice breaking. Carter's lips twisted into a knowing smile. "You think it's just about survival? About the truth of your father's past? No, Isabel, it's never been about that. You were always just a pawn." Nathaniel's world tilted sideways, his mind spinning with the revelation. Carter, the man who had given them information, the man who had helped them, was no longer an ally. His actions, everything he had done, had been a carefully orchestrated play to get them exactly where they were now. The realization hit Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. All the trust he had put in Carter, all the hours they had spent working together, had been for nothing. Carter had been working for the very people they were trying to escape all along. "You." Isabel's voice faltered as she took a step back. "You sold us out." Carter's expression didn't change. "I did what I had to do. You've got no idea the kind of game we're playing here. It's bigger than you think." He turned to the men who had ambushed them, giving them a silent nod. The grip on Nathaniel's throat tightened. "This isn't over," Carter said coldly. "Not by a long shot." With a final, deliberate glance, Carter turned and walked away, leaving Nathaniel and Isabel to face the devastating truth. They had been outplayed at every turn, their every move anticipated, their trust betrayed. The air was thick with an unrelenting tension as the city stretched out before them, its once familiar streets now unrecognizable, twisted, haunted by the shadows of decisions made in haste. Nathaniel and Isabel moved through the darkened alley, their footsteps muffled by the weight of impending confrontation. They had no choice now. The road ahead was fraught with danger, and there was no turning back. The betrayal had cut deeper than Nathaniel could have ever anticipated. Carter's sudden shift, his true allegiance revealed, had shattered any semblance of trust they had. But even more than that, it had given them something they hadn't had before: clarity. They knew what they had to do now. There was no room for doubt. Isabel was quieter than usual, her face pale, and her eyes distant. Nathaniel could see the internal battle waging within her. She had always been driven by the need for answers, for truth. But now she was faced with a choice that would define who she became. "We can't keep running," Isabel finally spoke, her voice low but firm. "We need to stop this now, Nathaniel. We need to face them. Face him." Nathaniel's heart tightened at the words. He had always believed in running. He had always thought the world could be escaped, that the past could be outrun. But this time, it was different. There was no running from what Carter had unleashed. "We'll face him," Nathaniel said, his voice hardened by determination, but his mind reeled with uncertainty. He had underestimated how deeply this fight would go. The stakes were beyond what he had prepared for. They turned the corner, the crumbling brick buildings around them rising like jagged teeth, and found themselves at the entrance of an abandoned warehouse. It was an eerie place, tucked far from the city's pulse, where the scent of rust and decay hung heavy in the air. The place seemed frozen in time, its glass windows shattered, its door ajar, inviting them into its darkness. "This is it," Isabel whispered, her eyes scanning the area. "This is where it all ends." Nathaniel nodded. His pulse thrummed in his ears as they walked inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. He could feel the weight of what was coming, the inevitable confrontation with Carter, the man who had once been an ally and now stood as their greatest threat. And beyond him, the men who had hunted them relentlessly. The silence was deafening as they moved deeper into the warehouse. The only sound was their breathing, the occasional creak of old floorboards beneath their feet. They weren't alone. The shadows seemed to shift around them, as though watching, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from behind them, and Nathaniel spun around. But it wasn't an attack. It was the sound of the warehouse doors slamming shut, locked. A figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette framed by the faint light filtering through the broken windows. Carter. His expression was unreadable, his posture confident, but there was something cold and calculating in his eyes. "So you've come," Carter said, his voice carrying a note of both admiration and disdain. "I knew you wouldn't back down." Nathaniel clenched his fists, his body brimming with the instinct to strike, but he held himself back. This wasn't just about anger anymore. This was about survival. And it wasn't just his life on the line. It was Isabel's too. "You betrayed us." Isabel spat, her voice laced with venom. "We trusted you." Carter's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Trust is a luxury," he said. "And you, both of you, have been blind to the truth. You were always pawns in a game much larger than you realized." Nathaniel's heart pounded. "What are you talking about? Why drag us into this? Why do this to us?" Carter's gaze flickered to Isabel, his eyes narrowing. "You don't even know the half of it, do you? Your father was never just a man of secrets. He was a key to something far greater than you could ever comprehend. You think your little rebellion means something? You think you can stop this?" He laughed, the sound echoing off the metal walls of the warehouse. "You were never meant to win. You were never meant to even survive." Isabel took a step forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "Then why are we still here? Why are you still talking to us? If we're nothing, why not just end it now?" Carter's eyes flickered to the men who had been silently gathering behind him. The cold calculation in his expression intensified as he looked back at Isabel. "Because, Isabel, you still have a purpose. You were never meant to be a bystander. You're more important than you know." A sudden realization struck Nathaniel like a punch to the gut. Isabel's father, the things they had uncovered, the betrayal. It wasn't just about their past. It was about something far darker, something far bigger than either of them had ever expected. What is it? Nathaniel's voice trembled as he stepped closer to Carter, trying to make sense of the situation. What's the purpose? Carter's smile widened, though there was no joy in it. The purpose is to watch you struggle, to watch you fight and lose. You'll find your place soon enough, just like your father did, just like I did. At that moment, the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. The other men, agents of a shadowy organization Carter worked for, moved forward, their eyes gleaming with anticipation. It was clear they were ready for a fight, but so were Nathaniel and Isabel. In a swift motion, Isabel pulled a gun from the waistband of her jeans, her hand steady, the weight of it an extension of her will. She wasn't the same woman she had been just a few days ago. The confusion, the fear, it had all given way to resolve. She was done running, done hiding behind the lies and half-truths. "Get out of our way, Carter," she said, her voice cold, unwavering. Carter's eyes lingered on the gun for a moment before he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with menace. "You think that's going to change anything? You think you can defeat me, or them, with a gun? This isn't about guns or fighting. This is about something much bigger, something beyond your control." Nathaniel could feel the finality in Carter's words, and for a fleeting second, a deep sense of dread gripped him. But Isabel wasn't listening anymore. Her finger tightened on the trigger, the gunshot ringing out in the silence. The bullet missed, barely, but the sound shattered the tension like 1,000 glass shards falling to the floor. In an instant, everything erupted into chaos. The agents surged forward, their movements precise, deadly. Nathaniel and Isabel sprang into action, but there was no slowing down the momentum now. This wasn't just a fight for their survival. It was a fight for everything they had ever believed. The gunshot echoed like a cruel reminder that they were no longer playing by the rules. In the thick of the chaos, Isabel and Nathaniel moved like dancers in the dark, fluid but precise, instinctively working as one driven by fear, the other by rage. Carter's agents closed in, their movements sharp, calculated. They were professionals, shadows in the flesh, their presence oppressive, like the unyielding weight of a storm cloud on the horizon. The air was thick, and the tension, a palpable force, made it difficult to breathe. Nathaniel slammed into the nearest agent, his fist landing square against the man's jaw. The blow was enough to stagger him, but not to knock him out. The agent recovered quickly, spinning around to counter. Nathaniel barely had time to react before a sharp pain pierced his side. The agent's knife had found its mark, but there was no time for pain. There was no time for hesitation. Nathaniel gritted his teeth, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he grappled with the man. His focus was unwavering. With a surge of strength, he twisted the agent's arm, disarming him and sending the knife skittering across the floor. He didn't hesitate before delivering a brutal strike to the man's throat, incapacitating him long enough to move on to the next threat. Isabel wasn't far behind. Her gunfire rang out again, another agent going down with a well-placed shot. But her expression was one of cold determination, her face set with a fierceness that was new, that Nathaniel had never seen before. She had crossed the threshold from fear to fury. They were no longer just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their freedom, for the truth, for a future that felt, until now, out of reach. Nathaniel's heart pounded in his chest, every muscle in his body burning with the effort. He was already bleeding, his side a dull throb of pain, but it didn't matter. It was nothing compared to what they were about to face. Isabel fired again, missing this time, but she wasn't deterred. Her next shot was true, taking down another agent. "We need to move," she said between breaths, her voice low but unwavering. "We can't stay here. It's only a matter of time before reinforcements arrive." Nathaniel didn't need any further urging. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back of the warehouse, where shadows and crates loomed like sentinels, watching over the carnage. The exit was close, but they had to be faster. The odds were no longer in their favor. Behind them, Carter's voice sliced through the madness like a whip, cold and mocking. "Do you really think you can escape this, Isabel? You think your little rebellion means something?" His laughter echoed around the empty warehouse, a twisted soundtrack to their flight. Isabel glanced over her shoulder, her eyes burning with defiance. "It's not about rebellion, Carter," she called back. "It's about stopping you. It's about putting an end to everything you've done." Nathaniel felt the words resonate within him, a final surge of strength pushing him forward. Carter was no longer just a figure to fear. He was a symbol of everything wrong in their world, everything that had been twisted beyond recognition. They reached the far side of the warehouse, but their path was blocked. The doors they had hoped to escape through were already filled with Carter's agents. It was a trap. The realization hit like a fist to the gut. "Don't move," one of the agents commanded, his weapon aimed squarely at Nathaniel's chest. Isabel's gun remained trained on him, but she knew the situation had shifted. They were surrounded. Nathaniel's mind raced, his thoughts a blur. The escape they had imagined now seemed impossibly far away. He knew they couldn't take on the whole force, not now, not when their backs were against the wall. "We've lost," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The crushing weight of defeat pressed down on him. It felt final, but something inside him, some flicker of resistance, refused to let go. "Not yet," Isabel replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She lowered her gun slowly, as though she had come to some quiet decision. Nathaniel watched her, the way her eyes hardened, the way she held herself even in the face of certain defeat. "Not yet," she repeated, her eyes meeting his. It was then that he understood. She wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Not now. Before Nathaniel could ask what she meant, the doors to the warehouse burst open with deafening force. The sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, came from behind them. Carter's agents turned toward the noise, but Nathaniel didn't wait to see who had arrived. He already knew who it was. It was the cavalry. In the doorway stood a group of figures, cloaked in darkness, their silhouettes unmistakable. They moved with purpose, their footsteps in perfect unison. It was the people Nathaniel had been waiting for, the ones who had been hunting Carter for years, the underground resistance. They were here, and they were ready to end this. The battle shifted immediately. The agents, caught off guard by the new arrivals, hesitated just long enough for the tide to turn. The resistance fighters, armed with everything from makeshift weapons to high-power rifles, tore into the agents with an intensity that made the ground beneath them tremble. The agents, caught in the crossfire, scrambled to regroup, but it was already too late. Nathaniel and Isabel didn't wait for the dust to settle. They dove into the fight, their hearts hammering in their chests. Nathaniel's instincts kicked in, each movement a blur of action as he fought with everything he had left. Isabel was beside him, her presence like a silent vow that this would not be the end. Not yet. The chaos was unimaginable. The sound of gunfire, the screams, the rapid thud of bodies hitting the floor. But through it all, Nathaniel felt a strange calm settle within him. This was it. This was the fight that would define everything. Carter's voice cut through the chaos once again, cold and mocking. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won." He emerged from the shadows, his face twisted in fury. "You don't understand, do you?" Nathaniel's voice was raw, laced with exhaustion, but it carried the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. "It's over, Carter. Your game is finished." Carter's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think that's true? You think you've won by bringing these people here?" He looked around at the resistance fighters, his voice dripping with contempt. "They're nothing, just pawns like you." But Isabel stepped forward, her eyes steady and determined. "We're not pawns anymore," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "We never were." And with that, the final confrontation began in earnest. It wasn't just a battle of fists and bullets anymore. It was a battle for everything: freedom, truth, justice. The fight for their futures had come to this moment, this final clash. The echoes of the final battle still hung in the air, the sounds of gunfire and clashing wills fading into a heavy, unsettling silence. The warehouse was in ruins, but it was not the debris that filled Nathaniel's mind. It was the weight of what had just transpired. What was supposed to be an end was now another beginning, but not one that offered clear answers. Only questions lingered. Nathaniel stood amidst the destruction, eyes scanning the chaos. Bodies, both enemy and ally, were scattered around the floor, but none more significant than the man who lay at the center of all, Carter. The once unshakable leader was now a shell of himself. His arrogance had melted away in the face of his inevitable downfall, replaced by a look of confusion and anger. But was the emptiness in his eyes that unsettled Nathaniel the most. The power that Carter had fought so hard to hold onto was gone, but in its place, there was nothing. Just the hollow stare of a man who had realized too late that he had destroyed everything, including himself. Nathaniel could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Carter was defeated, but the cost had been steep. They had won, but at what price? Isabel, now standing beside him, looked as though she, too, were struggling with the aftermath of their victory. Her eyes were raw, her face pale, but there was a strength behind her gaze, one that had been forged in the fires of loss, betrayal, and, ultimately, survival. "Is it over?" Isabel's voice cracked, but she tried to keep it steady, as if asking the question could somehow force a definitive answer from the shattered world around them. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. His mind replayed the final moments of their confrontation, Carter's chilling words still echoing in his ears. "You'll never understand what it cost," Carter had said, and there was a truth in that. They hadn't fully understood. Perhaps no one ever truly would. "There's nothing left of him," Nathaniel finally said, his voice low, almost uncertain. He turned his gaze to Isabel, who was looking down at the ground, lost in her thoughts. She didn't seem to hear him at first, her thoughts somewhere far beyond the remnants of their battle. But Isabel's silence didn't last long. She took a deep breath and nodded, though there was a flicker of something else in her eyes, a regret, perhaps, or even a fear of what came next. "I know," she whispered, "but the cost, it's still too much. I didn't just lose my father to Carter. I lost him long before that. I lost him to the lies, to the silence." Nathaniel stepped closer to her, his presence a quiet comfort amidst the wreckage. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer in this moment. He didn't know what to say. Words felt inadequate, as they often did in moments like these. Instead, he simply nodded, understanding far more than he cared to admit. The silence between them stretched long, the weight of all that had transpired hanging heavily in the air. It wasn't just the physical damage from the fight that needed tending to. It was the emotional wreckage, the scars left on them both. Suddenly, a faint sound pierced the stillness. Footsteps. Nathaniel's hand instinctively moved to his side, but Isabel held up a hand, stopping him. The figure that approached was unexpected. It was Isabel's father, battered but alive, his face bruised, but his expression one of quiet resolve. "You're still alive," Isabel whispered, her voice filled with disbelief, and something more, relief maybe. She took a step forward, but there was a hesitation in her movement. It was the hesitation of someone who had lost trust, someone who had been let down too many times. "I should have been there," her father said, his voice ragged, but there was a sincerity in it that cut through the tension. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't protect anyone." Isabel's eyes softened for just a moment, but the wall she had built up over years of abandonment and pain was not so easily torn down. She looked at him, and then at Nathaniel, her gaze flickering with the recognition of everything they had fought for. "I can't undo the past, Isabel," her father continued, his voice breaking as he looked at her. "But I am here now. I want to make things right." For a long moment, Isabel didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her emotions warring within her. The man who had once been her hero now stood before her, no longer the father she had longed for, but a man, flawed, broken, and perhaps, just perhaps, trying to redeem himself. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Isabel finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'll try. For what it's worth, I'll try." Her father nodded, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't offer a response, but instead lowered his head, acknowledging the truth of her statement. It wasn't forgiveness he sought, not now, not after everything that had happened. What he needed was time to prove that he could be trusted, that he was capable of redemption. As the quiet settled around them, Nathaniel stepped back, giving them space. He didn't need to be a part of their reconciliation. This was something they had to figure out on their own. He turned his eyes to Carter once more, the man who had been at the center of all their pain, the man who had torn lives apart with his greed and deception. Now, he was nothing, just a broken man whose empire had crumbled, whose lies had been exposed. The finality of it all hit Nathaniel with the weight of an avalanche. They had won, yes, but what did it mean? What came next? The world hadn't just shifted. It had been broken, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. But even in the destruction, there was a strange sense of peace, a fragile peace, one that would require effort and understanding to maintain. Nathaniel looked back at Isabel and her father, then back at the remnants of their battle. The world was changed now, but they were still here, still standing. That, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all. As the two of them moved toward each other, Nathaniel stepped into the shadows of the warehouse, away from the crumbled remains of Carter's empire. The light from the outside world filtered through the broken windows, casting long, stretching shadows on the floor. They were free, but the road ahead was uncertain. The truth was they would never fully know the cost of their freedom, because sometimes the only thing that mattered was the chance to rebuild, to live again, to find meaning in the chaos that had consumed their lives for so long. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory.